Ever feel like your emotions just kind of have a mind of their own? Like you're stuck in this loop and struggling to understand yourself and connect with others. Like, what if there was a way to just hit the reset button on your emotional intelligence? That's kind of what we're diving into today. Can psychedelics be the key to really mastering our emotions?
It's a question that a lot of people are asking, and it's for a good reason. There's more and more research coming out suggesting that psychedelics in the right context could be a really unique path to rewiring how we experience and manage our emotions.
We've got a ton of cool sources here: scientific studies, psychological insights, personal stories, and trauma seems to be a big part of this whole conversation.
Absolutely. Trauma can have a really lasting impact on the brain, and that can lead to emotional dysregulation and difficulty processing all that sensory information. It's like when we experience trauma, our brains basically go into survival mode, and the amygdala, the fear center, it just kicks into overdrive.
So it's like you're constantly in fight or flight mode, even when there's no real danger.
Exactly. And the sources we've got here describe how that can have this ripple effect throughout the brain. For example, Broca's area, which is super important for speech and language, it can actually go offline during trauma.
Wow. So that's why it can be so hard to put into words what happened or even just how you feel. It's like the trauma shuts down your ability to communicate.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to look at it. And it highlights why traditional talk therapy isn't always enough for trauma survivors. The sources also point out that trauma can disconnect us from our bodies, making it hard to even sense and regulate those emotions.
It's like you become disconnected from yourself almost.
Yeah.
You can't understand the signals your body's sending you. And then that disconnect can impact your relationships and even your sense of self, right?
Exactly, and that's where psychedelics come into the picture. They seem to have this ability to disrupt those patterns, those ingrained patterns of fear and emotional shutdown that trauma can cause. They can actually change the way the brain organizes information, so new connections and perspectives can emerge.
One of the sources compared it to like rebooting a computer. Suddenly those files that were locked away are accessible again.
It's a really good analogy. That shift in perspective can be super important for healing. The source material actually brings up EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, as a therapy that seems to work in a similar way to integrate those traumatic memories.
And the research on EMDR is pretty compelling, right?
Yeah.
The source mentions that EMDR patients did way better than those on Prozac, and they were more likely to stay symptom-free over time. That's huge.
It suggests that targeting the root cause of that emotional distress, the trauma itself, might be a lot more effective than just managing the symptoms with medication.
So it's not just about feeling better temporarily, it's about creating lasting change at a neurological level, which is so exciting about this whole area of research.
Exactly, and this potential for rewiring it goes beyond just trauma. The source material points to a recent study published in Molecular Psychiatry in 2024 that showed psilocybin-assisted therapy actually significantly increased emotional empathy in patients with major depression.
Now, empathy is key for emotional intelligence, right? It's that ability to understand and share the feelings of others. So if psychedelics can actually boost empathy, that's a game changer.
Absolutely. What's really interesting is that the biggest improvements in empathy were in response to positive stimuli.
So meaning that people were more in tune with joy, love, happiness, like their capacity for all those positive emotions grew along with their empathy.
Exactly. And these changes lasted for at least 2 weeks after just a single dose of psilocybin, suggesting that there's real potential for long-term benefits.
Okay, but before we get too carried away, are we saying that psychedelics are like a magic empathy pill? You just take one and boom, you're emotionally intelligent?
It's not quite that simple. It's important to remember that psychedelics are tools, and how effective they are depends on a lot of things. Setting the person's intention, their past experiences.
Right, it's not a guarantee. But what the research seems to be saying is that in the right context, psychedelics can create the conditions for some really profound emotional growth. It's like they give you a glimpse into what's possible, a different way of being.
That's a great way to put it. But for people who aren't ready to experiment with psychedelics, the source material highlights some other really powerful therapies that can tap into this potential for rewiring our emotional intelligence. Things like yoga and internal family systems therapy, or IFS.
Okay, so yoga is pretty common these days, but how does it connect to rewiring our emotional intelligence?
Well, yoga is all about the breath work, mindfulness, and physical awareness, and all of these practices can help us reconnect with our bodies and regulate our arousal levels.
So instead of being totally overwhelmed by your emotions, you learn to observe them understand them and respond in a more balanced way.
Exactly. The source material explains that when we become more in tune with our physical sensations, we actually develop a deeper understanding of our emotions. It's like you're learning to translate what your body's trying to tell you.
Okay, that makes sense. And IFS, remind us how that works again.
IFS, or internal family systems, is based on this idea that our minds are made up of these different parts, each with its own beliefs, emotions, and motivations.
It's like there's this whole cast of characters inside us, each playing a role in our internal drama.
Yeah, exactly. And trauma can often cause these parts to become really polarized, creating internal conflict and emotional dysregulation.
So instead of feeling whole, you feel fragmented, like you're being pulled in different directions by these internal battles.
Right, and IFS helps us identify and work with these different parts so we can have more self-compassion and heal those internal conflicts. It's like you're becoming the author of your own story instead of being at the mercy of your reactive parts.
This is all super insightful, but I think our listeners are probably wondering, does this stuff actually work? Can you give us some real-life examples of people who have gone through these emotional transformations?
Absolutely. The source material has a lot of great stories about people who've made these breakthroughs using these approaches. For example, there's Lisa, who used neurofeedback therapy to overcome really intense fear and dissociation that stemmed from childhood trauma.
Sounds like he was stuck in that fight or flight mode we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So how did neurofeedback help her?
Neurofeedback is a type of biofeedback that trains the brain to regulate its own activity. So for Lisa, it helped her calm down that overactive fear center in her brain, allowing her to feel safer and more grounded.
So she learned to manage the fear instead of being controlled by it.
Exactly. She described it as feeling more integrated, like all the different parts of herself were finally coming together. She even noticed a reduction in the constant inner chatter that she had been dealing with for years.
That's incredible. Are there any other examples?
There's Marie's experience with psychodrama. She had this deep-seated fear of her father, which also stemmed from childhood trauma. Psychodrama is a type of therapy that uses dramatic techniques to help people explore and process their emotions.
So it's like you're acting out your internal struggles.
In a way, yeah, for Maria, it allowed her to confront her fear, but in a safe and controlled way. By playing different roles and expressing her emotions through movement and dialogue, she was able to find this inner strength and resilience that she didn't even know she had.
Wow. It's like psychodrama gave her the tools to rewrite the whole script of her relationship with her father.
That's a great way to put it. She was able to step out of that victim role and reclaim her power.
These are so inspiring. Okay, one more example before we move on. What about people using EMDR or IFS?
I can actually share a personal story about EMDR.
Yeah.
I was going through a lot of anger and distress related to work, and even with everything I know about trauma and healing, I was really struggling to let go of those negative emotions.
So even the expert gets stuck sometimes.
We all do, but EMDR helped me process those feelings in a way that talk therapy hadn't. It was the combination of focusing on those painful memories while also doing things like eye movements or tapping.
And that somehow helps the brain reprocess the trauma.
That's the theory. And for me, it worked. I was able to let go of that emotional charge from the memories, and it felt like a huge weight had been lifted.
That's really powerful, and it shows that even people who work in the field of emotional well-being can benefit from these tools.
Absolutely. We're all on this journey of healing and growth, and these approaches can help us navigate the challenges that come up.
Speaking of journeys, let's get back to psychedelics for a minute. The source material mentions some real-life examples of people using them specifically for emotional breakthroughs.
Yes, it does. One story is about Julian, who was sexually abused by a priest when he was a kid. He had repressed the memories for years, but they eventually came back as these fragmented flashbacks and intense physical symptoms.
It's like his body was holding onto the trauma. Literally, the body keeps the score,
Yeah.
as one of our sources is titled.
Exactly, and his experience is not uncommon. A lot of trauma survivors struggle with these kinds of delayed reactions.
So how did psychedelics help him heal?
The source doesn't go into detail about the specific substances or the therapeutic setting, but it highlights how important it is to address self-blame in trauma recovery.
That makes sense. If you believe the trauma was your fault in some way, it would be so hard to move forward.
For sure, and for Julian, it seems that psychedelics helped him access those really deep emotions and work through those feelings of shame and guilt that were holding him back.
It's like they helped him face the truth of what happened and finally let go of the self-blame.
Yes, that's a powerful way to describe it, and it shows the potential of psychedelics to facilitate really deep emotional healing, even in cases of complex trauma.
So to answer our listener's question, Can psychedelics really be a shortcut to mastering our emotions?
I think it's really important to remember that they're not a magic bullet. They can be incredibly powerful tools, but they need to be used responsibly with the right preparation and integration.
Right. It's not like you just take a psychedelic and suddenly you're emotionally enlightened. There's work involved.
Exactly. These substances can open doors, but it's up to us to walk through them.
Okay, so if someone is interested in exploring this path, what should they keep in mind?
Safety is the most important thing. Do your research, find a qualified guide or therapist, and create a safe and supportive environment. And remember, psychedelics are still illegal in many places, so be aware of the legal risks.
Good point, but beyond the practical stuff, what else is important?
It's essential to approach this work with intention and respect. Psychedelics can be powerful catalysts for personal growth, but they can also be challenging.
Like anything worth doing, it's not always easy.
Exactly, but if you're willing to do the work, the rewards can be life-changing. It really is a fascinating question, and it speaks to this power that psychedelics have to potentially change not just how we feel individually, but also, the very fabric of how we connect with each other.
Okay, so we've been focusing a lot on these individual effects of psychedelics, on emotional intelligence. What about the bigger picture? One of the sources touches on the legal and social implications of all of this.
Yeah, it does. It brings up some really important questions about how we as a society approach these substances. The source actually argues that our current approach of just making drugs illegal has actually created this huge black market, and that's led to more violence and instability.
Yeah, that's a perspective that you hear more and more these days. A lot of people are criticizing the war on drugs and saying that it had this really devastating impact on communities, especially communities of color.
Exactly, and the source mentions countries like Portugal, where they've decriminalized drug use, and it's actually led to a decrease in overall drug consumption. So maybe shifting our approach from punishment to harm reduction could be more effective.
Yeah, it's definitely a radical change in thinking, but it seems like it's worth exploring, especially when we think about, the potential benefits of psychedelics for healing and personal growth.
I agree. It makes us rethink what's possible when it comes to emotional well-being, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
And speaking of reimagining possibilities, one of the sources brought up a concept that I thought was really cool, and it ties into this idea of collective healing. It's called Ubuntu. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah, Ubuntu. It's a Nguni Bantu term that speaks to the interconnectedness of all beings. The idea that our humanity is bound up in the humanity of others.
I love that. So it's not just about individual healing, it's about recognizing that we're all connected in this web of relationships and experiences.
Exactly. And Ubuntu has some powerful implications for how we think about healing from trauma, especially collective trauma.
That makes sense. If our traumas are interconnected, then our healing must be too right.
Exactly. When we acknowledge and address these shared wounds that connect us, we can create a more just and compassionate world.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, but how do we actually put Ubuntu into practice? It feels like a pretty big concept to grasp.
Well, it starts with small acts of empathy and understanding things like listening to each other with an open heart, recognizing our shared humanity, offering support when someone is struggling.
So basically remembering that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And the source material highlights the importance of creating safe spaces where people can share their stories, process their emotions, and find a sense of belonging. Think back to those theater groups we talked about.
Oh, right. They provide that structured setting for people to explore those difficult emotions and connect with others who get it.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be a formal program. It can be something as simple as having those real conversations with your loved ones, starting support groups in your community, or even engaging in restorative justice practices.
So the key is to create a culture of empathy, where being vulnerable is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
That's it. That's the essence of Ubuntu.
Well, I think we've really gone deep on this topic. Any last thoughts you want to share with our listeners as they keep thinking about psychedelics and emotional intelligence?
Just remember, this journey of emotional growth, it's a lifelong thing. There's no quick fix, no magic pill, no one-size-fits-all solution. It's all about being curious, trying new things, and finding what works for you.
Being patient with yourself.
Exactly. Healing takes time, and there will be bumps along the way, but it's so worth it because emotional intelligence helps us live more fulfilling, connected, and meaningful lives.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating topic. And, this whole idea of Ubuntu, it's really powerful. It's like our journeys toward emotional intelligence, they aren't just about us as individuals. They're about creating this collective well-being. you know?
I love that analogy. It's like we're all threads in this huge tapestry, and when we strengthen our own emotional threads, it strengthens the whole thing.
Exactly. And when you look at it that way, it's clear that emotional intelligence isn't just some extra bonus. It's like crucial for building a more compassionate and interconnected world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some things our listeners can take away from all of this? How can they keep developing their own emotional intelligence and maybe even contribute to that Ubuntu tapestry? Well, I think the most important thing is to be curious and have compassion for yourself. There's no one right way to do this whole emotional growth thing. It's about trying different things, experimenting with different tools, and finding what clicks for you.
And being patient with yourself along the way, right?
Yeah.
Healing takes time, and there are going to be setbacks.
Absolutely. Every step you take toward understanding your emotions and learning how to manage them, it's a step toward a more fulfilling life for yourself and a more compassionate world for everyone.
So well said. This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this exploration has sparked something in you and inspired you to keep going on your own journey of emotional discovery. Until next time, keep diving deep.